Namaste. A very good day to all of you. This is Professor Ajeet Jaiswal, Head Department of Anthropology. Let's start discussing the second lecture of the lecture series on Indigenous Knowledge System from the Earth for the Future. Today we are going to discuss about the history of Indigenous Knowledge System. The history of Indigenous Knowledge System spans millions of years old and is deeply intertwined with the cultural, social and environmental fabric of indigenous communities worldwide. While each indigenous group has its unique knowledge system, there are overarching themes and historical development that shape the collective understanding of indigenous knowledge system. If you try to understand from the prehistoric origin point of view, indigenous knowledge can be traced back to prehistoric time when early human society developed complex understanding of their environment through observation, through experimentation and cultural transmission. Indigenous people developed sustainable practice of hunting, gathering, agriculture and resource management and often passed down orally from generation to generation. Similarly, if you try to understand from the colonial encounters, the arrival of colonial power marked a significant turning point in the history of indigenous knowledge system. Colonizers often dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive or inferior, imposing Western society paradigms and marginalizing indigenous practices. Many indigenous knowledge systems faced suppression, erasures, and cultural assimilation under colonial rule, leading to the loss of traditional ecological knowledge and cultural heritage. Similarly, if we try to understand from the resistance and resilience point of view, despite centuries of colonizations and oppression, indigenous communities around the world has demonstrated resilience in preserving and revitalizing their knowledge system. Indigenous resilience movement have fought for the recognition and protection of indigenous rights, including the rights of land, rights of resources, and cultural heritage. Efforts to decolonize education and research have led to a greater appreciation for indigenous knowledge and the integration of traditional ecological knowledge into a contemporary scientific practices. Similarly, if we try to understand from the global recognition point of view, or if we can say that the current context point of view, in the recent decades, there has been growing recognition of the value of indigenous knowledge system in addressing global challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable development. Indigenous, or we can say that international initiative such as United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, what we call it as a UNDRIP, have affirmed the right of indigenous people to maintain, to control, protect and develop their knowledge system. Collaborative partnership between indigenous community, researchers and policymakers have led to the co-production of knowledge and the development of innovative solutions rooted in both indigenous and scientific knowledge system. Not only that, there is a series of challenges, there are series of opportunities. We have to understand and take that part also in a very specific context. When we discuss about challenges or opportunities, we may say that despite progress, indigenous knowledge systems continue to face threat from ongoing processes of globalization, urbanizations, and environmental degradation. Issues of intellectual property right, issues of cultural appropriation, and ethical consideration surrounding the use of indigenous knowledge system or indigenous knowledge remains contentious and unresolved. However, there are also opportunities for indigenous knowledge to contribute to sustainable development, to contribute to biodiversity conservation and intercultural dialogue in increasingly interconnected world. In summary, when we say, as far as the summary of the historical context concerned, the history of indigenous knowledge system is characterized by resilience, resistance, and adaptation in the face of colonization, in the face of globalization, and in the face of environmental change. Recognizing and respecting indigenous knowledge is not only a matter of social justice but also essential for addressing the complex challenges in the 21st century. Now, let's start discussing the another important feature of indigenous knowledge, which we call it as a characteristics of indigenous knowledge. It is very important for us to understand it. When we discuss about characteristics of indigenous knowledge possesses several distinct characteristics that differentiate it, make it different from any other knowledge system. Some of the key characteristics of indigenous knowledge is oral tradition, holistic approach. It is embedded in cultural and tradition, place-based and content-specific, sustainable practices, experimental and observational, collective and communal ownership, adaptive and dynamics. So there are 8 important features that is known to be the characteristics of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge. Now when we discuss about all these 8 points one by one, like when we say that oral tradition, indigenous knowledge is primarily transmitted orally from generation to generation, often through storytelling, rituals, and direct experimental learning or experiential learning. Written documentation is very limited or quite limited, and the emphasis is placed on the oral transmission of knowledge within the community. Similarly, when we discuss about its holistic approach characteristic, indigenous knowledge is holistic in nature, recognizing the interconnectedness of all aspects of life, including humans, the environment, animal, plant, and spiritual dimension. It considered the interdependence of these elements and emphasized the need to maintain balance and harmony among them. Similarly, when we try to understand it from the embedded in cultural and traditional point of view, indigenous knowledge is deeply embedded within the cultural and traditional practices of knowledge community. It reflects the value, it reflects the belief, it reflects the customs and worldview of the community, serving as a foundation for cultural identity and social cohesion. Similarly, if we try to understand from the place based on context specific, we may say that indigenous knowledge is closely tied to a specific geographical location or ecosystem. It is adapted to local environmental condition and resources and cultural context, reflecting the intimate relationship between indigenous people and their land. Similarly, if you try to understand the another characteristic feature, that is sustainable practices, indigenous knowledge often incorporate sustainable practices that have evolved over generations to ensure the long-term well-being of both human and the environment. These practices emphasize resource conservation, biodiversity preservation, and resilience to environmental changes. When we try to understand from the experimental or experiential and observational point of view, indigenous knowledge is derived from direct observation, direct experience, and experimentation within the local environment. It values practical wisdom gained through life experience and encourage active engagement within the natural world. Similarly, when we try to understand from the collective and communal ownership point of view, indigenous knowledge is collectively owned and shared within the community rather than being attributed to individual authors or experts. It fosters collaboration, reciprocity, and solidarity among the community members, reinforcing social bond and mutual support. The last important characteristic feature is adaptive and dynamic. Indigenous knowledge is adaptive and responsive to changing environmental, social, and cultural context. It evolved over time through ongoing interaction with the environment, innovation, and the integration of new knowledge and practices. So, we may say that recognizing and respecting this characteristic is essential for understanding the richness, its diversity, and value of indigenous knowledge, and for promoting its integration with the contemporary development, initiative, and policy making process. So, these are the important 8 characteristic features of indigenous knowledge. Thank you.